We all want to read interesting books, am I right? We want to read books that challenge, that provoke, that entertain. And too often we find ourselves reading books that are serviceable, passable. They hit the genre beats or conventions that we like, but don't necessarily delve any deeper than that. Basically, shit that doesn't have anything to say. I've always thought that the point where art and entertainment meet is just when an author or a filmmaker or an artist has something to say. Fuck the genre label or the conventions. I honestly couldn't give a bollocks whether it's a exiled prince returning to save his kingdom, whether it's an alcoholic self-destructive detective trying to solve a murder, or whether it's a romance between two lifelong friends who finally get it on their road trip with their mates. If an author has something to say, I'm in. James Ellroy is an author with a lot of shit to say, so I'm in. The self-described demon dog of crime fiction is a little bit of an enigma. As a personality, publicly he puts on this brash, politically incorrect persona where he says a lot of things to provoke. His personality can come across as bitingly funny if you ever watch him in interviews. He can also come across as a monumental take your pick. Is any of it real? Who knows? Maybe not. Maybe there's more truth in there than he'd like us to believe. But either way, he's pretty fucking interesting. And his books, I think, reflect that sort of brash persona. Now, The Black Dahlia is not my first experience or exposure to the demon dog of crime fiction. That would be American Tabloid, which I also think is a phenomenal book, but a phenomenally difficult book, actually. I've had my trials and tribulations of that unconquered beast over the last few years, where I have started it multiple times, gotten quite far, but just never quite cracked the code with it, even though I think it's an outstanding book. He has a very distinct style that I find difficult to get in sync with, but American Tabloid is an epic scope book as well, where he packs a lot of detail into his famous telegrammatic style that he has. He is a prose stylist, so it is not your run-of-the-mill work of crime fiction that you'll get. In American Tabloid, the main crime is politics, and every character in that book is a shitbag, or a shitbird, as Ellroy likes to say. So before revisiting American Tabloid for the third or fourth time, I decided to go back to what is one of his more traditional or conventional books, to a point, which is The Black Dahlia. And this one clearly has Ellroy's early style, him finding his voice, but it is more conventional on a surface level. LA Noir, with a pair of lead detectives trying to solve a murder. The Black Dahlia, obviously, as the title suggests, concerns one of the most famous unsolved murders in the history of Los Angeles, which is the city where James Ellroy was born and raised. And the more you dig into this book and Ellroy as a personality, as an author, it's kind of inseparable from his work, because it's hard not to see some elements of semi-autobiographical storytelling in this book and just how he is in general and what he writes about. He's a man that lives in the past. In 1958, in Los Angeles, when he was 10 years old, James Ellroy's mother was brutally murdered. And that murder went unsolved. And that murder was also of a psychosexual nature. That, I think, went on to shape how Ellroy writes and what he writes about and what he has to say or explore. And The Black Dahlia was a good one to go back to before revisiting American Tabloid for the umpteenth time, because admittedly it's just plain easier to read. But the funny thing about this book is that I actually think it's at its weakest when it's dealing with all of the normal traditional conventions of the genre, which is the two lead detectives trying to solve this case. The first 150 pages of this book are fucking scintillating. It is unbelievable. It's full of atmosphere and rhythm and energy and verve and nerve and fucking swerve. And when we meet the two main characters. So there's Bucky Bleichert, who is basically the main detective we follow, and his mate Lee Blanchard. They're basically getting ready to do this charity boxing match, I think, between two cops. But they're both professionals, so it's this sort of lead up to them having this camaraderie and rivalry, and they're the kind of the talk of the town as they're leading up to this boxing match between them. And there's sort of mini local celebrities, I guess. But there's just so much energy to the first half of this book leading up to the actual murder and then the investigation, the ensuing investigation. That first half of this book is some of the best crime writing I've ever read. I was completely hooked. And then I think once he started to build his little tapestry of crazy conspiracy and theories and just the minutiae of the case and the investigation and the kind of convoluted nature of the plot itself, when he focused on that, this book lost itself in there somewhere. So to use a bit of a cliche, it's a book of two halves, two very distinct halves. And it doesn't mean that it falls off a cliff for me with the kind of convoluted plot in the second half, but it certainly doesn't have that energy and that biting, scintillating rhythm of the first half. But knowing what I know about Ellroy, I think this was the first time where he really explored that style that he'd become famous for later, and a style that I've honestly kind of struggled with over the years. But basically what happens in the Black Dahlia is Bucky Bleichert and Lee Blanchard kind of get obsessed with the Black Dahlia, the case of the Black Dahlia, and we get a strange, fucked up look at psychosexual obsession and what is it that fascinates people about violence that can be this brutal. And the way he also writes the discovery of the murder and the actual, that incident that is about halfway through the book, it punches you in the gut. And I think you can use that as a descriptor for a lot of Ellroy's writing in general, but it really does punch you in the gut. It is hyper violent and explicitly described, not the event itself, but how the body looks. And then because that is the first time either of these men have ever seen anything this horrendous and horrific, it just lodges in their brains and they can't let it go. And I think when you just know a little bit about the author going into the book and what he's gone throughout his life, his childhood, it does add a layer of intrigue into what he's trying to say or what he's trying to explore. So through all of the genre bells and whistles that you might find in the book, it just does become an exploration of obsession and a certain kind of very dangerous and violent obsession that might overtake somebody entirely. And the ironic thing here is that it's the detectives trying to solve the murder that also become equally as obsessed with this crime as possibly the person who committed the crime. Now, in real life, this murder was never solved, but Ellroy solves it in this book. And I've watched a couple of interviews with him now where he talks about how he sets out, he wants to write essentially historical fiction as a mythology of America with 75% distortion and 25% fact, and he'll let you figure out which is which. And I just really like that, because that's also him inviting you in to read and judge for yourself. On the internet, and people talking about books on the internet, there is a lot of talk and a lot of sort of, I guess, cliched repetition and phrases that we have and buzzwords and shit. Like, the main one that kind of annoys me is the morally grey character. And it's used as a marketing ploy, and it's just sort of done the rounds so much now that it doesn't mean anything anymore. And I feel like most of the time when it's used, it doesn't actually apply. And what the fuck does it even mean anyway? What are any of us if not morally grey? We're humans. It seems like a bit of a cop-out dreamland phrase. And I think that if you're in any way interested in morality, Ellroy is an interesting writer to read. He is a profoundly cynical writer, which is a worldview I don't share. Like, I'm pretty sure that I will not agree with James Ellroy on kind of everything, except for maybe the fact that I think that a lot of politicians are fucking shitbags. But what I think he is trying to explore and look at is bad people trying to find some semblance of humanity in a system where bad people fucking thrive. And I find that pretty interesting. Given the state of the world right now, you may not want to read something like this, but I find it particularly interesting right now to see, are these things that people glorify or they're just fascinated by? Do we just allow people to get away with horrible stuff because we have a morbid fascination and obsession with it? Is there like a voyeuristic need to see horrible shit happen? And I think that's the question that Ellroy is kind of circling around here, at least in my own interpretation. And I'm also just sort of grateful that it was slightly easier to follow than American Tabloid has been over the years, which I also think is a great book. Some authors have a poetic flow or a sort of an ease about the writing that makes it seem effortless, and they read effortlessly and it washes over you. Ellroy doesn't really do that. He takes a fucking power drill to your balls, or your nether regions, if you don't have them, and he just makes you go along for the ride, and you need to be switched on. But then I found that with the Black Dahlia, I was absolutely locked in for that style for the first 150 pages, and he just made everything more convoluted, and I think he focused on the things that I wasn't interested in him focusing on. I've had an interesting question in the couple of months now that it's been since I read this book. It's whether I think, and also like my experience with American Tabloid, is asking myself whether I think James Ellroy is nihilistic or not. And I think he makes it an interesting thing to ponder. You know, people talking about books on the internet love to talk about dark shit being nihilistic automatically without giving the meaning of the word any thought at all. And to be perfectly blunt, if you think someone like George R. R. Martin or A Game of Thrones is nihilistic, I think you just fundamentally don't know what nihilism is. I think there's a interesting question around Ellroy where he seems to believe that some of his characters are heroic, but they're just not good people. But I think that's exactly where he wants to operate. He wants to operate in the weeds, but I think the fundamental thing to know is the difference between nihilism and cynicism. A bit like Jim Thompson, he's an exceptionally cynical writer, but cynical in a fascinating and often kind of funny way. This book is funny, and so is American Tabloid. It is very, very funny. You will laugh. There is just something about the delivery and the timing of it, but the fact that everything is so outrageous, it is funny. And I think that that's a style of humor that really works for me. It's quite dark, it's cynical, but it's not cynical in a I'm superior kind of way. It's just like, here's this shit situation, and you laugh to not cry. You can see the influence that writers like Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett had on Ellroy, and obviously they operate in the same city, the same location, which is obviously the geography and the atmosphere give it a old film noir quality to it, but also just the rhythm and the pace of it and the hard-hitting prose. He's clearly followed a lineage of writers, and he's clearly grown up with that mythology that he's trying to add to. And he, like his predecessors, is trying to raise this genre into another level, into a sort of a higher art form. And if you're in any way interested in crime fiction, or you like crime fiction, he's an author that just should be read, even if his style of storytelling is not your favorite, which that is probably the case for me. It's not my favorite style of storytelling, but he's undoubtedly a writer with something to say that you should pay attention to. So I think this year I fully intend to read the rest of the LA Quartet because I've put it off for too long now. I'm also revisiting American Tabloid. So more of these reviews will come. We also intend to have more crime classics reviews. We might go back and talk about old books we read ages ago as well. So stick around for more of that. I'm sure you're all interested. Like the video if you liked it, do all of that shit, and we'll see you guys next time. Check out the Black Dahlia.